The rain came down cold that November afternoon in 1978, drumming against the leaded glass windows of a mansion so vast it had its own zip code. Inside, lawyers in wool suits shuffled papers across mahogany tables while outside, beyond the manicured lawns turned to mud, the steel mills of Pittsburgh belched their last breaths into a dying sky. The Clayton estate, all 64 rooms of it, stood silent, waiting. Waiting for a family to decide whether love or money mattered more. They chose money. And in choosing, they destroyed everything. This is the story of how one of America's wealthiest dynasties tore itself apart over an inheritance so vast it could have fed a small nation. But more than that, it's the story of how wealth, when left to ferment in the dark corridors of legal language and generational resentment, becomes not a blessing but a curse that echoes through decades. The Mellons didn't just lose a fortune. They lost themselves. Let's go back to the beginning. To a time when the name Mellon meant something close to royalty in America. To understand the war, you first have to understand the empire. In 1869, when most of America was still raw frontier, Thomas Mellon sat in his Pittsburgh law office and made a decision that would alter the course of American capitalism. He abandoned law, steady, predictable law, and opened a bank. Not just any bank. T. Mellon and Sons would become the financial engine that powered the industrialization of the entire American interior. His sons, Andrew and Richard, didn't just inherit a business. They inherited an ideology, that wealth was a moral responsibility, that capital must grow, that softness was sin. Andrew Mellon would go on to become the third richest man in American history when adjusted for inflation. Only John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford surpassed him. But raw numbers don't capture what the Mellons actually controlled. They financed the creation of Alcoa, transforming aluminum from a laboratory curiosity into the metal that would build airplanes and reshape warfare. They bankrolled Gulf Oil, turning Texas crude into a global empire. They funded the construction of the Panama Canal through strategic investments that made other men's ambitions possible. When the government needed money during World War I, they didn't issue bonds to the public first, they went to Andrew Mellon. When the Gilded Age needed a face, it wore Mellon features. By 1900, the family's asset allocation stretched across every sector that mattered: energy, metals, banking, transportation, real estate. Conservative estimates placed their consolidated wealth at over $90 billion in today's currency. Not 90 million. 90 billion. And that's likely an undercount because the Mellons, unlike the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers, understood the value of silence. They didn't build opera houses with their names carved into the stone. They built power quietly, behind closed doors where liquidity crises were solved with a phone call and operating costs were someone else's problem. But Richard Beatty Mellon, Andrew's younger brother, wanted something different. Something tangible. Something he could walk through and feel. In 1912, he commissioned the construction of Clayton, a mansion in Pittsburgh's Point Breeze neighborhood that would serve as the family's anchor. The estate wasn't just a home. It was a statement. The architecture blended English Georgian revival with touches of Italian Renaissance, a deliberate echo of European old money, transplanted into the soil of American industry. The construction costs alone, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $40 million. The ground sprawled across 11 acres of manicured perfection, rose gardens tended by a staff of 12, greenhouses that grew orchids in the middle of Pennsylvania winters, a carriage house that could store 20 vehicles. Inside, the details bordered on the obscene. Ceilings soared 20 feet high, supported by hand-carved mahogany beams imported from Honduras. The main staircase, a sweeping double helix of polished oak, took a team of craftsmen 18 months to complete. Each room told a story of capital gains made flesh, walls covered in silk damask from Lyon, chandeliers of Waterford crystal that scattered light like captured stars, floors of inlaid parquet so intricate you hesitated to walk on them. The library alone housed over 5,000 first editions, leather-bound and meticulously catalogued, including a Shakespeare folio worth more than most Americans would earn in 10 lifetimes. This wasn't wealth. This was wealth's cathedral. Richard and his wife Jenny filled Clayton with art that would eventually form the core of the National Gallery of Art's collection: Rembrandts, Vermeers, Cézannes. They hosted dinners where Supreme Court justices debated with steel magnates under ceilings painted by the same Italian craftsmen who restored Venetian palazzos. The guest lists read like a directory of American power: presidents dined there. J.P. Morgan sent his regrets when he couldn't attend. Henry Clay Frick, whose own mansion was a monument to excess, reportedly toured Clayton and left quietly envious. The servants' quarters alone were larger than most middle-class homes of the era. 42 staff members lived on-site, including a butler who earned the equivalent of $60,000 annually in today's money, 3 French chefs who rotated menus seasonally, and a household manager whose sole job was coordinating the other employees. The operating costs of Clayton exceeded $2 million per year, adjusted for inflation. That's just to keep the doors open, the gardens trimmed, the silver polished. The Mellons generated that amount in passive interest income before breakfast. If you're starting to sense something beautiful here, something almost intoxicating in its ambition and scale, that's exactly the point. Because they wanted you to feel that. They built Clayton to be admired, to be envied, to stand as proof that America could produce not just wealth but civilization. That the coal dust and factory smoke could birth something transcendent. And for a while, it worked. But here's what they didn't talk about at those glittering dinners. Here's what never appeared in the society pages when they described Mrs. Mellon's latest soiree. The coal that heated Clayton through Pittsburgh's brutal winters came from mines in West Virginia and Kentucky where men died at a rate of 6 per week. Not per year. Per week. The Mellon-backed mining operations ran on a simple calculation: extracting coal was profitable at a certain threshold, and that threshold required keeping labor costs minimal and safety standards theoretical. In 1923 alone, over 300 men died in Mellon-financed mines. Some from cave-ins. Many from black lung, which wasn't even officially recognized as an occupational disease because the medical research proving causation wasn't funded, suppressed, actually, by the same industrial concerns that owned the mines. The aluminum that built the chandeliers in Clayton's ballroom came from plants where workers suffered chemical burns so regularly that the company hospitals, yes, Alcoa ran its own hospitals, kept dedicated burn wards. OSHA didn't exist yet. Workers' compensation was a fringe concept. If you lost a hand to molten metal, you lost your job. If you died, your family received nothing unless they could prove negligence in court, and the company lawyers always won. The wealth generated by Gulf oil came from extraction operations that turned indigenous lands in Oklahoma and Texas into toxic wastelands. Treaties were violated not through violence, that was too messy, too visible, but through financial instruments that native communities couldn't parse and legal frameworks specifically designed to be incomprehensible. The Mellons didn't steal land at gunpoint. They foreclosed on it, legally, after extending credit they knew couldn't be repaid. Cleaner that way. This is not to say the Mellons were uniquely evil. Carnegie did the same. Rockefeller perfected it. But the Mellons were uniquely efficient at transforming human suffering into asset allocation. And they did it with such polish, such refinement, that even now, a century later, we tour Clayton and marvel at the craftsmanship rather than asking who paid the real cost. Jenny Mellon, Richard's wife, kept detailed diaries. They're archived now, available to researchers who care to look. In them, she describes her daily routines with the precision of a woman trained to notice beauty. The way morning light struck the conservatory glass. The scent of roses in July. The particular shade of green the lawn turned after rain. She never mentions the miners. Not once. It's possible she didn't know. More likely, she knew the way we all know things we've chosen not to examine too closely. The system worked for her, and questioning it would require dismantling the very foundation of her existence. Richard died in 1933, at the height of the Great Depression. A depression that, ironically, barely touched the Mellons. When banks failed across the country and families lost their savings, the Mellons' diversified holdings, energy, metals, European bonds, actually increased in relative value. Richard left an estate valued at over $4 billion in today's currency. His will, drafted by a team of 12 lawyers over the course of 3 years, attempted to do something almost no wealthy family successfully achieves: preserve the fortune intact for future generations while also distributing it fairly. The will was 67 pages long. It established trusts within trusts, created foundations to manage philanthropic giving, and outlined a precise hierarchy for Clayton itself. The estate would pass to his son Matthew, then to Matthew's children, with stipulations about maintenance, public access, and preservation. The art collection would be donated to the nation. Eventually, it formed the core of the National Gallery. The liquid assets would be divided into carefully calibrated trusts designed to provide income without depleting principal. Every contingency seemed covered. Every future seemed planned. What Richard Mellon didn't account for was the one variable no amount of wealth can control: human nature under pressure. Matthew Taylor Mellon inherited Clayton in 1933, and with it, the impossible task of being the steward of a legacy that had already calcified into myth. He was 31 years old. He'd been trained his entire life for this moment, educated at Yale, apprenticed in the family's banking operations, married to a suitable woman from an equally prominent family. But Matthew had something his father and uncle lacked: doubt. He'd lived through World War I, seen the industrial might of America turn toward killing with the same efficiency it applied to producing steel. He'd watched the Depression hollow out Pittsburgh, turning streets he'd walked as a child into breadlines and Hoovervilles. And he'd begun asking questions that didn't have comfortable answers. Questions about responsibility. About the social contract. About whether accumulating more wealth made sense when the system that generated it was eating people alive. These weren't popular questions at the Mellon family dinners. Matthew did something radical for an heir to an industrial fortune: he paid attention. He visited the Gulf oil refineries and saw the burn scars on workers' forearms. He toured Alcoa plants and noted the respiratory symptoms in men under 40. He read the letters that came to the family foundation, thousands of them during the Depression, from widows, from mothers, from children begging for help. And unlike his father, he read them not as evidence of the unfortunate necessity of progress, but as indictments. If this made you pause, that pause matters. Because what we're really talking about here isn't just a family losing money over legal battles. It's about the moment when someone inside the machine starts questioning whether the machine should exist at all. These stories take time to uncover: decades of archive work, cross-referencing wills and testimonies, tracking down descendants who remember fragments of conversations, and that level of research is only possible when there's space to do the work properly. In 1938, Matthew made a decision that fractured the family. He publicly supported unionization efforts at Mellon-financed plants. Not with statements, he wasn't that bold, but with behind-the-scenes negotiations, with pressure on plant managers to recognize collective bargaining, with donations to labor organizers that he hid in the accounting but that inevitably surfaced. His mother discovered the contributions when reviewing the foundation's books. The confrontation happened in Clayton's library, according to a cousin who overheard parts of it. Jenny Mellon, elderly by then but still commanding, accused her son of betraying his father's memory. Matthew responded that he was trying to honor what his father should have built, rather than what he did. The family split quietly, as rich families do. No shouting. No tabloid scandals. Just cold financial realignment. Certain trusts were adjusted. Certain invitations stopped arriving. Matthew remained the technical owner of Clayton, but his influence within the broader Mellon financial empire began to erode. His cousins, who'd taken leadership roles in Mellon Bank and Gulf Oil, started excluding him from strategic decisions. By 1945, he was essentially isolated, living in the mansion, maintaining its operations, but functioning more as a caretaker than a patriarch. Then came the war. World War II saved the Mellon fortune the way it saved many American industrial fortunes, by creating bottomless demand for exactly what they produced. Aluminum for airplanes. Oil for tanks and ships. Banking services for war bonds. The Mellon companies ran 3 shifts around the clock, and the profits poured in at a rate that made even the Gilded Age look quaint. Between 1941 and 1945, the family's consolidated wealth grew by an estimated 40%. 40%. During a war that killed 70 million people. Matthew watched this from Clayton, increasingly alienated, increasingly bitter. He stopped attending board meetings entirely by 1948. Started drinking heavily, bourbon, always bourbon, from a Waterford decanter in the same library where his mother had confronted him. He'd walk the halls of Clayton at night, his footsteps echoing on marble floors, and sometimes talk to the portraits of his ancestors as if expecting them to respond. The staff grew concerned. His wife left him, quietly, with a generous settlement that bought her silence. He was alone in a 64-room mansion, surrounded by art worth hundreds of millions, attended by servants who pitied him. Before we go further into what happened next, ask yourself something: what would you do if you inherited a fortune built on foundations you couldn't defend? If every comfort you enjoyed came with the invisible weight of someone else's suffering? Would you tear it down? Walk away? Or would you, like Matthew, simply drown slowly in the contradiction? He died in 1963, at 57, of liver failure exacerbated by decades of drinking. The official cause listed on the death certificate was cirrhosis. But anyone who knew him understood he died of something else, the unbearable heaviness of inherited guilt. And that's when the real battle began. Matthew's will surprised everyone. He'd revised it 7 times in the last decade of his life, each version more radical than the last. The final version, filed just 8 months before his death, attempted to dissolve the traditional inheritance structure entirely. Rather than passing Clayton to his children intact, he divided the estate into competing trusts with overlapping claims. He established a foundation that would take control of the mansion and convert it into a public museum, but with operational funding to come from other family assets. He designated specific art pieces for specific institutions, but with conditions that required unanimous family approval to execute. He created educational endowments with vague criteria that practically invited litigation to clarify. Legal scholars who've studied the document describe it as either the work of a deeply conflicted man trying to do right, or a deliberate act of sabotage. Possibly both. Matthew knew his children, 5 of them, from 2 marriages, would fight. He'd watched them grow into the kind of people the Mellon fortune produces, entitled, ambitious, convinced of their own specialness. By making the will a labyrinth, he forced them to either cooperate or destroy each other trying to navigate it. They chose destruction. The initial court filing came in 1964. Matthew's eldest son, Richard II, contested the will on grounds of mental incompetence, arguing his father's alcoholism invalidated the document. The evidence was compelling: medical records showing emergency hospitalizations, testimony from household staff about Matthew's declining state, financial documents with increasingly erratic notations. But Richard II's true motive was transparent: he wanted Clayton for himself, along with the controlling interest in several trusts that would provide liquidity, approximately $800 million in today's money. His siblings immediately countersued. Sarah, the eldest daughter, argued that Richard II's filing violated the terms of an earlier family agreement and that he'd hidden assets during the estate inventory. Michael, the 3rd child, filed for co-ownership of Clayton based on letters he claimed his father had written promising him the estate. Those letters were almost certainly forgeries, but proving it required document analysis, handwriting experts, and months of depositions. The legal costs began accumulating at a rate of $50,000 per month, adjusted for inflation. The case went to probate court, where Judge Harrison Mitchell presided with increasing frustration. His rulings were models of judicial precision, but the Mellon lawyers operated on a different level. They filed motion after motion, each one technically valid, each one introducing new complexities that required additional hearings. They deposed servants who'd left the estate decades prior, tracked down Matthew's former business partners, subpoenaed medical records from sanitariums he'd visited in the 1950s. The goal wasn't justice. The goal was attrition. By 1968, the case had split into 7 separate lawsuits, each feeding off the others like legal metastases. One suit concerned the art collection: should it go to the National Gallery as Matthew specified, or be sold to fund the estate's operating costs? Another concerned mineral rights on property Matthew had owned in Pennsylvania, rights worth potentially hundreds of millions if developed, worthless if left dormant. A third concerned Clayton itself: could it legally be converted to a museum if the family objected? Pennsylvania law was murky on the question, and both sides hired constitutional scholars to argue precedent. The children stopped speaking to each other entirely by 1970. Family holidays ceased. When Sarah's son got married in 1972, Richard II wasn't invited. When Michael's daughter died in a car accident in 1974, Sarah didn't attend the funeral. The inheritance war had metastasized beyond legal strategy into something darker: mutual assured destruction as family policy. Meanwhile, Clayton itself began to decay. The will's conflicting instructions meant no one had clear authority to maintain the property. The roof developed leaks that weren't repaired because doing so might acknowledge ownership. The gardens, once immaculate, grew wild because hiring staff required drawing from accounts that multiple parties contested. By 1975, the mansion's operating costs had fallen to near zero, but that wasn't efficiency, it was abandonment. The chandeliers gathered dust. Mold spread through the conservatory. Pipes froze in winter because no one authorized the heating bills. If you're still here, watching this unfold, you're here for more than spectacle. You're here because something about this resonates: the way families fracture, the The way wealth curdles into poison, the way legal systems designed to resolve disputes become weapons that perpetuate them. That recognition matters. The trusts established by Richard Mellon in 1933, designed to preserve wealth across generations, faced their own crisis. As the legal battle stretched into its second decade, those trusts began bleeding capital. Not from bad investments, the Mellon financial managers were too skilled for that, but from legal fees. By 1978, the consolidated costs of the inheritance litigation exceeded $900 million. Not in property values. In actual cash spent, lawyer salaries, court fees, expert witnesses, document storage, private investigators hired to uncover each other's secrets. $900 million spent on arguing about who deserved money they were spending to argue about. The broader Mellon family watched this with horror and, occasionally, private satisfaction. Distant cousins who'd already received their inheritances saw the Clayton branch tearing itself apart and felt vindicated in their own restraint. The Mellon bank executives, some of whom were blood relatives, quietly restructured their operations to distance the institution from the public spectacle. Gulf Oil, by then a publicly traded company, stopped mentioning the Mellon connection in annual reports. The family name, once synonymous with competence and power, became shorthand for dynastic collapse. But the worst damage wasn't financial. It was human. In the archives of the Allegheny County court system, buried in boxes that smell of old paper and institutional neglect, are the depositions. Hundreds of them. The Mellon children, their spouses, their own children, all paraded through conference rooms to testify about conversations half remembered, intentions half understood, promises that might have been made or might have been wishful thinking. Reading them is unbearable. Not because of what they say, but because of what they reveal about what wealth does to people. Richard II's 1979 deposition shows a man who spent 15 years fighting and can no longer remember why. He talks about his father in the past tense, but he's really talking about himself, the man he might have been if inheritance hadn't become his sole identity. He admits, under questioning, that he hasn't actually visited Clayton in 8 years. That he's not sure he'd recognize it anymore. That the mansion has become more symbol than place, more idea than home. Sarah's testimony from 1981 is worse. She describes finding her father drunk one night in 1962, crying in the library, talking about wanting to burn Clayton down. Wanting to eliminate the problem at its source. She'd assumed he was joking, or too intoxicated to mean it. But sitting in that deposition, 2 decades later, she wonders if he'd been serious. If he'd seen then what she couldn't, that the inheritance would poison them. She breaks down crying during the questioning, and the court recorder notes it clinically. Witness becomes emotional. Brief recess. Michael's deposition never happened. He died in 1977 of a heart attack at 43. His widow continued the lawsuit on behalf of their children, but the documents show she barely understood what she was fighting for. The lawyers managed her like a puppet, feeding her lines, positioning her as a sympathetic figure to sway judges. She remarried within a year and moved to California, but the trust funds meant she couldn't fully escape. The litigation followed her, phone calls from attorneys, requests to sign documents she didn't read. The younger generation, the grandchildren of Matthew Mellon, grew up in the shadow of this. They learned about their family not through dinner table stories but through court filings. They understood their inheritance not as a blessing but as a burden that would define them before they'd chosen anything for themselves. Some refused it outright, signing away their claims in exchange for small settlements. Others doubled down, hiring their own lawyers to ensure they'd get their share of whatever remained. By 1985, 21 years after the initial filing, Clayton had been empty for over a decade. Vandals broke in repeatedly, stripping fixtures, smashing windows. Local teenagers used it for parties, leaving beer cans and graffiti in rooms where Frick and Carnegie had once debated tariff policy. The city considered condemning it as a public hazard, but the legal tangles made even that impossible. Who would they serve the notice to? Every party claimed ownership. None claimed responsibility. A local Pittsburgh journalist named Margaret Wu visited Clayton in 1987 and wrote a piece that finally broke through the public indifference. She described walking through rooms where silk wallpaper hung in strips, where the parquet floors were warped from water damage, where mold had turned the walls black. She found the library, where 5,000 first editions had once resided, now empty except for scattered pages from destroyed books. Someone had built a fire in the marble fireplace using rare manuscripts as kindling. The Waterford chandelier in the main hall had crashed to the floor years earlier and no one had cleaned it up, just a spray of crystal shards that crunched underfoot like ice. Wu's article asked a question that seemed obvious but that no one had bothered to articulate: was this what Matthew Mellon wanted? Had the attempt to break the cycle of inherited privilege succeeded, or had it just resulted in meaningless destruction? The piece went mildly viral, in the way things did before the internet. It got picked up by the Associated Press, reprinted in newspapers across the country, discussed on local talk radio. For a brief moment, the Clayton inheritance war became a symbol of something larger: the end of the American dynastic era, the failure of wealth to perpetuate itself, the poetic justice of a mansion built by exploitation now consumed by entropy. But symbols don't solve legal cases. The first real break came in 1989, when Richard II died. Not dramatically, just quietly, in his sleep, at a Philadelphia hospital. He was 63. His portion of the lawsuit passed to his children, but they lacked his stubborn commitment to winning at any cost. Within 6 months, they'd settled with Sarah, accepting a division of assets that gave them cash and released their claims to Clayton itself. That left Sarah and the trusts established by Matthew's will. The trusts had their own legal standing, their own lawyers, their own imperatives that had nothing to do with family reconciliation. They existed to perpetuate themselves, to defend the language of the will regardless of outcome. Sarah's lawyers argued that the trust interpretations were fundamentally wrong, that Matthew's intent had been deliberately misread. The trust lawyers countered that intent didn't matter, only the precise language of the document. This phase of the battle lasted another 4 years. 4 years of appellate filings, of legal theory debates that would bore you to death if I recounted them, of arguments about semicolons and dependent clauses in a 67-page will. But underneath the tedium was a real question: can you force a family to honor someone's wishes after death, even if those wishes destroy them? In 1993, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court finally issued a ruling. It didn't resolve the case; instead, it sent it back to the lower court with instructions to mediate. The justices, reading between the lines of decades of litigation, essentially said, "You're all insane, figure this out among yourselves, stop wasting our time." The opinion used polite legal language, but the subtext was clear. The mediation happened in a conference room in downtown Pittsburgh, in a building that had once been a Mellon Bank branch. Sarah attended, now 68 years old, accompanied by lawyers who'd spent their entire careers on this case. The trust representatives attended, gray-suited men who spoke in the passive voice about fiduciary duties and adjusted basis calculations. And for the first time, they brought in someone neutral, a professional mediator named David Chen who specialized in high-net-worth family disputes. Chen's report from that mediation, portions of which were later filed with the court, describes an almost therapeutic process. He didn't let them talk about the law at first. He made them talk about what they'd lost. Not the money. The actual losses. Sarah admitted she hadn't spoken to most of her cousins in 30 years. That her children didn't know their second cousins. That she'd spent the majority of her adult life angry and wasn't sure she knew how to be anything else. The trust representatives, speaking not personally but institutionally, acknowledged that the perpetual litigation had violated the spirit, if not the letter, of their obligations. And slowly, painfully, they built a framework for ending it. The final settlement, reached in December 1994, took 72 pages to document. 30 years after Matthew's death, the inheritance war ended not with victory but with exhaustion. Clayton itself would be donated to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, which would restore it and operate it as a historic house museum. The art collection, what remained of it, would go to various institutions as Matthew had wanted, some to the National Gallery, some to Pittsburgh museums, some sold to fund the restoration. The liquid assets from the contested trusts would be divided according to a formula so complex it required actuaries to calculate. Sarah received approximately $40 million, adjusted for inflation. The trusts received operating funds to continue managing other Mellon philanthropic commitments. The lawyers received their fees, never fully disclosed, but estimated at over $300 million across the 3 decades. So let's do the math. The estate Matthew Mellon left was valued at approximately $4 billion in today's currency. After 30 years of litigation, the actual distribution to heirs totaled perhaps $700 million. The rest? Consumed by legal fees, by property depreciation, by opportunity costs of capital tied up in contested accounts earning minimal returns. The lawyers won. They always do. Clayton opened to the public in 1997 after a $40 million restoration. You can visit it now, if you're ever in Pittsburgh. The Conservancy did remarkable work. They sourced period-appropriate wallpaper, restored the mahogany ceilings, even repaired the parquet floors using techniques from the 1910s. Walking through it today, you'd never know it had been abandoned, vandalized, nearly lost. It looks pristine. Perfect. But here's what the tour guides don't tell you. Here's what doesn't appear on the informational plaques. The inheritance war destroyed 3 marriages among the Mellon descendants. It contributed to at least 2 documented cases of clinical depression requiring hospitalization. It consumed the professional lives of 14 lawyers, several of whom later spoke anonymously about the ethical weight of perpetuating litigation they knew was destructive. It alienated an entire generation of Mellon heirs from each other, fractures that have never healed and likely never will. And it cost, in total, over $3 billion that could have been used for literally anything else. $3 billion. Gone. Not invested, not donated, not even spent on luxuries. Just evaporated into the legal industrial complex that exists to referee fights between people who have more money than they could spend in 100 lifetimes. The foundation Matthew established to promote workers' rights and labor protections dissolved during the litigation, its funds absorbed into legal costs. The scholarships for children of minors that he'd endowed ended in 1982 when the trust ran out of operating funds. The public museum he'd envisioned achieved, eventually, but 30 years late and only after the property had been gutted and rebuilt. If you're feeling something right now, anger, disgust, maybe even a kind of hollow recognition, that reaction means something. It means you're recognizing a pattern that goes beyond one family. Because this isn't just the Mellon story. This is the story of how inherited wealth, when combined with legal systems designed by and for the wealthy, creates perpetual motion machines of suffering that grind down everyone involved. Sarah Mellon died in 2009, at 84. Her obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned the inheritance settlement but described it diplomatically as a complex family matter resolved through mediation. It listed her charitable contributions, her memberships in various boards, her surviving children and grandchildren. It did not mention that she spent her final years estranged from most of her family. That she'd expressed regret, privately, to her daughter about the decades of fighting. That she'd visited Clayton only once after it became a museum and left after 15 minutes, unable to stay. The remaining descendants, the great-grandchildren of Richard and Jenny Mellon, are scattered across the country now. Some use the Mellon name. Others have legally changed it, wanting no association with the legacy. A few have spoken publicly about the inheritance war, usually to warn others about the dangers of leaving ambiguous wills or concentrated wealth. But mostly, they stay silent. The trauma of watching your family destroy itself over money is not something people eager to discuss at dinner parties. Clayton still stands, beautifully restored, a testament to Gilded Age ambition and craftsmanship. Tour groups walk through it daily, marveling at the chandeliers and the oak staircase and the silk wallpaper. They take photos. They comment on how the other half lived. The tour guides, trained by the Conservancy, tell stories about the architecture, about the art collection, about the Mellons' role in Pittsburgh's development. They mention the inheritance dispute briefly, if at all, as a footnote about family complexity. But here's what you need to understand: standing in those restored rooms, every inch of beauty you see is inseparable from the ugliness that created it. The fortune that built Clayton came from mines where men died gasping for breath. The systems that preserved it were designed to exclude everyone outside the tiny circle of privilege. And the legal mechanisms that tore the family apart were the same mechanisms they'd used for generations to protect themselves from accountability. You can't have the mansion without the mine. You can't have the inheritance without the war. They're the same story. Before we close, there's one more document worth discussing. In 2003, during the restoration, workers found a sealed envelope hidden behind a panel in the library. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 1962. Matthew Mellon had written it and apparently hidden it deliberately, perhaps knowing, or hoping, it would be found someday. The letter is kept in the Conservancy's archives. It's not on public display. But researchers can request to see it, and I did. The handwriting is shaky, clearly written while intoxicated or in emotional distress. But the words are lucid. He writes about standing in the library late at night, surrounded by books he'd never read, in a house he'd never chosen, holding wealth he couldn't justify. He writes about his father and uncle, about the empire they'd built and the cost they'd never acknowledged. And then he writes this. I don't know how to fix what they broke. I don't know if it's even possible. But I know that giving my children this place, this money, this weight, would be repeating the sin. So I'm trying something else. I'm making it impossible to inherit cleanly. I'm forcing them to reckon with the cost, even if that reckoning destroys everything. Maybe especially if it destroys everything. Because what's the point of preserving beauty built on bones? What's the point of generational wealth that generates nothing but pain? He goes on for 3 more pages, rambling, contradicting himself, expressing hope and despair in equal measure. But that central question hangs there: what's the point? The Clayton inheritance war didn't answer that question. It just illustrated it, in the most expensive, destructive way imaginable. The Mellon spent $3 billion learning something Matthew already knew, that you can't redeem dirty money by fighting over it. You can only spend it, or give it away, or let it consume you from the inside out. And here we are, decades later, in an era when wealth inequality has reached Gilded Age levels again. When billionaires fight over companies and fortunes while people work 3 jobs to afford rent. When inheritance has become, once again, the primary determinant of opportunity in America. The mechanisms are slightly different: tax shelters instead of trusts, offshore accounts instead of family banks, but the structure is the same. And the costs, hidden or not, are the same. If you've stayed with this story until now, it's because some part of you recognizes that this matters beyond gossip or schadenfreude. Because these patterns repeat. Because the Clayton inheritance war isn't history, it's a warning that we're choosing, collectively, to ignore. What would it take for that to change? What would it take for inheritance to be seen not as a right but as a question, one that demands real answers about who builds wealth, who it harms, and what obligations come with keeping it? I don't have those answers. Matthew Mellon didn't either. But asking the question, really asking it, sitting with the discomfort it creates, is the only starting point I can see. Share this if it made you think. Not because it's entertaining, but because conversations that cost this much to avoid are usually the ones we need most. And if you're building or inheriting wealth yourself, ask, what would I be willing to destroy to keep it? What would I be willing to lose to do it right? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They're urgent ones. Clayton stands. The family doesn't. That's the inheritance. That's what's passed down, not the mansion, but the warning. The rain has stopped now, decades later. The gates are open. You can walk right in, $5 for admission. The floors are polished. The chandeliers gleam. And if you listen carefully, in the silence between tour groups, you can almost hear it, the echo of voices that spent 30 years fighting over which of them deserved to inherit something that should never have been built in the first place. That's the cost. That's always the cost. The silence in the restored rooms of Clayton is not a peace, it is a meticulously managed vacuum, a polite erasure of history designed for $5 admission. Yet, the warning is not confined to this Pittsburgh landmark. What the Mellon saga illuminates is a fundamental structural flaw in the modern capitalist project, the deliberate, legalistic separation of capital from its human and environmental cost. Look beyond the mansion's mahogany beams and Waterford crystal, and you see the architecture of inequality perfected. The Mellons, and the dynastic families that followed, did not merely accumulate wealth, they engineered systems where their capital was perpetually insulated from consequence. When Thomas Mellon shifted from law to banking, he formalized the rule that the legal framework serves the owners of capital, turning the system itself into the ultimate moat. The lawyers who spent 30 years draining the estate of $3 billion weren't villains, they were the high priests of this system, their motions and depositions the rituals by which the wealth, even as it was destroyed, was kept out of the hands of the public good, out of the communities whose labor and land had built it. The modern echo of this is deafening. We see it in the opaque trusts that shelter trillions from taxation, the complex offshore maneuvers that make accountability a legal impossibility, and the political lobbying that ensures the rules are continuously written to benefit the heirs, not the creators. The legal-industrial complex of today has simply traded the probate courtroom for the appellate division and the offshore registry. The core dynamic remains, a hyperconcentration of wealth that cannibalizes the institutions designed to govern it. The generational wealth Matthew Mellon wrestled with is now passed down not just through bank accounts, but through control of media, technology, and public policy, turning the very idea of a fair, social contract into a historical relic. The lesson of Clayton is not about a bad family squabble, it is an indictment of a system that views human life as an externality to be managed and the law as a private tool for perpetual preservation. The question Matthew scrawled in that hidden letter, "What's the point of generational wealth that generates nothing but pain?" is now a macroeconomic question that defines our era. We look at the gilded prisons of today's billionaires, watch them launch themselves into space, and fight over social media companies, and we see the same moral vacuum, the same spiritual emptiness that drove Matthew to the bottle. The trauma passed down to the Mellon grandchildren, the burden of inherited guilt and public expectation, is the same poison now infecting the fabric of society, as a new generation grapples with a world diminished by the insatiable growth model that demanded the coal mine to build the cathedral. Clayton, beautifully restored, is a museum of a collapse we are currently repeating, a silent, perfectly polished tombstone marking the spot where the American elite chose money over everything, including their own soul. The rain has stopped, the gates are open, but the lesson, like the black lung in the miner's lungs, is still working its way through the system, waiting for the moment we finally choose to listen to the echo of the ruin they left behind. The silence in the restored rooms of Clayton is not a peace, it is a meticulously managed vacuum, a polite erasure of history designed for $5 admission. Yet, the warning is not confined to this Pittsburgh landmark. What the Mellon saga illuminates is a fundamental structural flaw in the modern capitalist project, the deliberate, legalistic separation of capital from its human and environmental cost. Look beyond the mansion's mahogany beams and Waterford crystal, and you see the architecture of inequality perfected. The Mellons, and the dynastic families that followed, did not merely accumulate wealth, they engineered systems where their capital was perpetually insulated from consequence. When Thomas Mellon shifted from law to banking, he formalized the rule that the legal framework serves the owners of capital, turning the system itself into the ultimate moat. The lawyers who spent 30 years draining the estate of $3 billion weren't villains, they were the high priests of this system, their motions and depositions the rituals by which the wealth, even as it was destroyed, was kept out of the hands of the public good, out of the communities whose labor and land had built it. The modern echo of this is deafening. We see it in the opaque trusts that shelter trillions from taxation, the complex offshore maneuvers that make accountability a legal impossibility, and the political lobbying that ensures the rules are continuously written to benefit the heirs, not the creators. The legal industrial complex of today has simply traded the probate courtroom for the appellate division and the offshore registry. The core dynamic remains, a hyperconcentration of wealth that cannibalizes the institutions designed to govern it. The generational wealth Matthew Mellon wrestled with is now passed down not just through bank accounts, but through control of media, technology, and public policy, turning the very idea of a fair, social contract into a historical relic. The lesson of Clayton is not about a bad family squabble, it is an indictment of a system that views human life as an externality to be managed and the law as a private tool for perpetual preservation. The question Matthew scrawled in that hidden letter, "What's the point of generational wealth that generates nothing but pain?" is now a macroeconomic question that defines our era. We look at the gilded prisons of today's billionaires, watch them launch themselves into space, and fight over social media companies, and we see the same moral vacuum, the same spiritual emptiness that drove Matthew to the bottle. The trauma passed down to the Mellon grandchildren, the burden of inherited guilt and public expectation, is the same poison now infecting the fabric of society, as a new generation grapples with a world diminished by the insatiable growth model that demanded the coal mine to build the cathedral. Clayton, beautifully restored, is a museum of a collapse we are currently repeating, a silent, perfectly polished tombstone marking the spot where the American elite chose money over everything, including their own soul. The rain has stopped, the gates are open, but the lesson, like the black lung in the miner's lungs, is still working its way through the system, waiting for the moment we finally choose to listen to the echo of the ruin they left behind. The real tragedy is not that the Mellon fortune was reduced by $3 billion in legal fees, but that the apparatus of its destruction was itself a perfectly functioning mechanism of capital preservation. The lawyers, those tireless acolytes of the semicolon and the dependent clause, did not steal the money, they merely rerouted it through the system's own digestive tract, ensuring that the wealth remained concentrated in the hands of the educated, the powerful, and those who understood the language of the rule of law better than anyone else. The fight was not over who deserved the money, but over who deserved the control of the money's legal structure, a metaphysical battle fought in mahogany-paneled conference rooms. This is the ultimate, chilling refinement of inherited privilege. Even the act of failure, the inability to transfer wealth peaceably, becomes a source of immense profit for the class that maintains the wealth-generating system. Today, this phenomenon has mutated, trading the dusty, paper-strewn battle of probate court for the sleek, digital warfare of venture capital and tech IPOs. The new cathedrals of wealth are not Georgian mansions, but server farms and glass-skinned headquarters, and the new moats are not trusts but stock classes and opaque corporate charters. The current-day Matthew Mellons, the billionaire children who inherit a dystopian tech legacy or a global logistics empire built on precarious labor, are wrestling with the same unbearable heaviness of guilt, but with exponentially fewer options for redemption. They cannot simply support a union, as Matthew did. Their companies are the union busters, their algorithms the primary tools of labor suppression. They cannot merely donate a fraction to a foundation. The scale of their wealth requires them to build parallel societies, private space programs, proprietary health clinics, sovereign wealth fund-sized family offices, that render the very concept of the public good obsolete. The quiet desperation Matthew felt in the library of Clayton, the sense of standing alone amidst an indefensible fortune, is magnified 1,000 times in the digital age, where every ethical lapse is broadcast globally, yet insulated legally. The inheritance passed down now is not just money and property, it is an obligation to defend a machine that has become too powerful to stop, a machine that uses the law, technology, and political capture to enforce the separation between its profits and its consequences. The environmental disaster is an externality. The labor exploitation is an externality. The democratic erosion is an externality. All are compartmentalized, accounted for, and legally protected by the very structures the Mellons pioneered. The warning Matthew left, that he was forcing them to reckon with the cost, is a tragically ironic epitaph for the entire dynastic class, because the system they built has ensured that the reckoning for the children consists not of moral clarity, but of hiring a better crisis management firm and lobbying for a lower capital gains tax. The destruction Matthew engineered was finite, the destruction the modern system perpetuates is total. The restored beauty of Clayton is a lie we pay $5 to believe, a belief that the damage can be repaired, that the cost can be contained, and that the long, dark shadow of generational wealth is merely a historical curiosity. It is not. It is the living, breathing rule of our age, and until we dismantle the legal architecture that protects wealth from its own moral weight, the beautiful, silent rooms of our own increasingly unequal world will continue to echo with the sound of a system consuming itself, leaving only a perfectly polished vacuum where a functioning society used to be. The ultimate inheritance is the certainty that the war is never truly over, only passed down to the next generation of attorneys, heirs, and a public left to tour the ruins. A